The Waterford crystal hit the kitchen counter with a sound that made my heart skip. Not shattered, thank God, but close enough to make me catch my breath. I watched my late husband's mother's sugar bowl wobble precariously on the granite surface, and something twisted in my chest. These weren't just dishes. They were the last tangible pieces of the woman who'd raised the man I'd loved for 43 years. "Careful with those, Jessica," I said gently, reaching to steady the delicate piece. "They belong to—" "I know exactly whose they were." Jessica's voice cut through the afternoon air like winter wind. She turned from the sink, her blonde hair catching the September light streaming through the apartment windows, her green eyes flashing with something I'd never seen before. Not just irritation, something uglier. "And I know how to handle dishes in my own home." The words hung between us like smoke. My own home. I felt the familiar tightness in my throat, the same feeling I'd had when the doctor told me Robert's cancer had spread, when the funeral director asked about flower arrangements, when I'd signed the papers that made me a widow at 67. But this was different. This was my son's apartment, the place where Michael had lived since his father died, and Jessica had only moved in after their wedding 18 months ago. "Of course you do, sweetheart," I said, forcing my voice to stay level. "You were just what, Linda?" Jessica set down the sponge with enough force to splash soap suds onto her cream-colored sweater. The same sweater I'd given her last Christmas, I realized with a pang. Criticizing how I take care of things? Implying I'm not good enough for your precious family heirlooms? I blinked, genuinely confused. Where was this coming from? I'd simply mentioned being careful with century-old crystal. The same thing any reasonable person would say. "Jessica, I wasn't criticizing anything. These pieces are just fragile, old, irreplaceable?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Just like their previous owner, right? Just like you're going to be?" The kitchen fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic 15 floors below and the soft tick of the antique clock on Michael's mantelpiece, another family piece Jessica had complained about just last week. I studied my daughter-in-law's face, looking for some sign of the sweet young woman my son had brought home 2 years ago. The one who'd asked thoughtful questions about family recipes and admired the stories behind our photographs. "I'm not sure what's upset you," I said carefully. "But if I've done something—" "What's upset me?" Jessica's voice rose, and I glanced instinctively toward the living room where Michael sat reviewing quarterly reports for his accounting firm, the same meticulous attention to detail that had made his father proud. "What's upset me is having you waltz in here every Sunday like you still run this family, like we're all still children waiting for your approval." My mouth opened, then closed. Sunday dinners had been our tradition for 3 years now, ever since Robert's first surgery. Michael had suggested them, insisted on them even, as a way to keep some normalcy, while his father faded away in hospital beds and treatment centers. They'd continued naturally after the funeral, a bright spot in the gray landscape of my new life. "I thought you enjoyed our Sunday visits," I managed. "Enjoyed them?" Jessica turned fully toward me now, and I could see something wild in her expression, something unhinged. "Having you scrutinize everything I cook, everything I clean, everything I say, having you tell the same old stories about when Michael was little and what Robert would have wanted, having you treat this place like it's still your territory." Each word hit like a physical blow. I gripped the edge of the counter, feeling the cool granite under my fingers, anchoring myself to something solid while my world tilted sideways. In the living room, I could hear the rustle of papers, the scratch of Michael's pen. He was 20 feet away, but he might as well have been on Mars. "I never meant to make you feel," I started. "Make me feel what? Unwelcome in my own home? Inadequate? Stupid?" Jessica stepped closer, and I caught a whiff of the expensive perfume she favored, something French and sharp. "Do you think I don't know what you're really doing here, Linda? Do you think I don't see the way you look at everything, judging whether it's good enough, whether I'm good enough?" My heart was racing now. This wasn't the Jessica I knew. This was someone else entirely, someone with years of resentment suddenly boiling over like milk left too long on the stove. But resentment over what? I'd tried so hard to be welcoming, to be helpful without overstepping, to be the kind of mother-in-law I'd always wished I'd had. "Jessica, please, let's sit down and talk about this. If I've made you uncomfortable—" "Uncomfortable?" She laughed again, high and brittle. "Uncomfortable doesn't begin to cover it. Try humiliated. Try suffocated. Try constantly reminded that I'll never be good enough for your perfect son, in your perfect family, with your perfect little traditions. The words hit me like slaps, each one landing with surgical precision on every fear I'd harbored since Robert died. That I was too much, that I was clinging too tightly, that I was the kind of widow who couldn't let go and let her children live their lives. That's not, I whispered. It is exactly that. Jessica's voice dropped to something low and dangerous. And I'm done with it. I'm done with you coming here and making me feel like a guest in my own home. I'm done with your subtle little comments and your meaningful looks and your assumption that you belong here. In the living room, the papers stopped rustling. I wondered if Michael could hear us, if he was listening, if he would come to see what was happening. My son, my gentle boy who hated conflict, who'd inherited his father's need for peace at any price. Jessica stepped even closer, close enough that I could see the tiny lines around her eyes, the ones she'd started covering with expensive concealer. Close enough to see that this wasn't sudden rage. This was something that had been building for months, maybe years, carefully constructed and deliberately saved for exactly this moment. So here's what's going to happen, Linda. Her voice was perfectly calm now, perfectly controlled, which somehow made it more terrifying than her shouting had been. You're going to leave. Today. Right now. And you're not going to come back. The kitchen spun slightly around the edges. Jessica, I don't want to see you at Sunday dinners anymore. I don't want you dropping by with groceries or helpful suggestions or family stories. I don't want you in my space, touching my things, judging my life. She smiled then, and it was the cruelest expression I'd ever seen on another human being. This isn't your house, Linda. It's mine. And old, useless women aren't welcome here. Something inside me cracked, not broke, cracked, like ice on a frozen pond, the kind of crack that spreads slowly but inevitably until the whole surface gives way. I looked past Jessica toward the living room, waiting for the sound of Michael's footsteps, for his voice calling out to ask what was wrong. Instead, I heard the soft click of his laptop closing, then the deliberate silence of someone pretending not to hear. My son. My boy who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms, who'd called me every day during his father's illness, who'd sobbed against my shoulder at the funeral, was sitting 20 feet away while his wife destroyed me with words, and he was doing nothing. The crack in my chest widened. I see, I said quietly, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, like it was coming from underwater. Jessica's smile widened. I'm so glad we understand each other. I nodded slowly, looking one last time at the Waterford crystal, at the kitchen where I'd helped prepare dozens of family meals, at the doorway where my son sat in deliberate, cowardly silence. Then I picked up my purse and walked toward the door, my heels clicking against the hardwood floors that Robert and I had helped Michael pick out 3 years ago, when he'd first bought this place, and we'd all been so proud, so happy, so blissfully unaware of how quickly love could turn to ash. I paused at the door, my hand on the brass handle that I'd helped polish when Michael moved in. You're right, Jessica, I said, without turning around. This isn't my house, but as I walked toward the elevator, one thought blazed through the humiliation and heartbreak with startling clarity. It wasn't hers either. The elevator doors closed, and I began planning. The elevator descended in perfect silence, each floor marked by a soft chime that seemed to echo the beating of my heart. 15 floors down, 15 chances to change my mind, to go back up there and apologize for whatever imaginary offense had triggered Jessica's explosion. 15 opportunities to be the good mother-in-law, the understanding widow, the woman who knew her place. By the time I reached the lobby, I'd rejected every single one. The late afternoon sun hit my face as I stepped onto Madison Avenue, and I had to squint against the brightness. September in Manhattan. Still warm enough for the lightweight cardigan I was wearing. Still bright enough to make the city feel alive and full of possibility. Even for a 68-year-old woman who'd just been thrown out of her son's apartment like yesterday's newspaper. I walked slowly toward the subway, my mind spinning with fragments of the conversation. Old, useless women aren't welcome here. The words kept replaying, each repetition adding a new layer of sting. But underneath the hurt, something else was growing. Something that felt suspiciously like relief. For 18 months, I'd been walking on eggshells around Jessica, carefully moderating every comment, second-guessing every suggestion, trying to be the perfect mother-in-law, trying to be invisible enough to be acceptable, but present enough to maintain my relationship with Michael. It had been exhausting, like holding my breath underwater and pretending I could breathe. Now, at least, I knew where I stood. The subway platform was nearly empty, that blessed lull between the afternoon rush and evening commute. I stood waiting for the train, remembering the last conversation I'd had with my real estate agent, Patricia Hawthorne. Efficient, sharp-eyed Patricia, who'd helped Robert and me buy our first apartment 40 years ago, who'd guided me through selling it after his death, who'd called just last week with an unusual opportunity. "Linda, darling," Patricia had said in her perfectly modulated Upper East Side accent, "I have something that might interest you. It's unconventional, but given your investment goals, a penthouse, the building's crown jewel, 2 floors directly above Michael's apartment. The previous owner, some tech entrepreneur, had been transferred to Singapore and needed to sell quickly." Patricia had shown me the listing photos on her tablet. Soaring ceilings, wraparound terraces, floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the city into a living painting. "It's priced to move," she'd explained. 30% below market value if you can close within 2 weeks. Cash only, no inspections as is condition. The seller wants simplicity. I'd looked at those photos for a long time, imagining myself in that light-filled space, imagining the view of Central Park, imagining being close enough to Michael to maintain our relationship, but independent enough to have my own life, my own space, my own territory. "I'll think about it," I'd told Patricia. But even then, I think I'd already decided. The train arrived with a rush of warm air and mechanical noise. I found a seat and pulled out my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found Patricia's number. She answered on the second ring. "Linda, please tell me you're calling about the penthouse." "I am." I watched the tunnel walls blur past the window, each mile taking me further from Jessica's cruel smile and Michael's silence. "If the offer's still available, I'll take it." Patricia's intake of breath was audible. "Seriously? Just like that? Just like that. Darling, that's wonderful. I'll call the seller's agent immediately. With cash, we can probably close by the end of next week. Are you sure you don't want to see it first? I know I showed you photos, but I'm sure." And I was. For the first time in months, I was absolutely, completely sure about something. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in my own apartment. My temporary apartment, I corrected myself, looking out at the view I'd enjoyed for the past year. A modest 1-bedroom on the Upper West Side, perfectly adequate for a widow learning to live alone. Safe, sensible, small enough that I couldn't get lost in it the way I sometimes got lost in the memories of the home Robert and I had shared. But as I looked around at my carefully arranged furniture, my grandmother's quilts, my collection of first edition novels, I realized something had changed. This apartment had been a retreat, a place to hide while I figured out how to be Linda without Robert. The penthouse would be something else entirely. It would be a declaration. I made myself a cup of tea and settled into my reading chair, the one piece of furniture Robert had specifically requested I keep, because he knew how much I loved the way the afternoon light hit it just right. Then I called my financial advisor. "Linda," James Henderson said warmly, "good to hear from you. How are things?" "Changing," I said simply. "I need to liquidate some investments, about $2 million, as quickly as possible." There was a pause. James had been handling our finances for 15 years, had guided us through Robert's illness, had helped me navigate the complexities of inheritance and estate planning. He was accustomed to my careful, considered approach to money. "May I ask what this is for? Real estate? A cash purchase?" "Ah." Another pause. "Linda, I have to ask. This isn't some sort of emotional decision, is it? I know the anniversary of Robert's passing is coming up, and sometimes it's not emotional, James. It's strategic." And it was. For the first time since Robert died, I was making a decision based not on grief or fear or the need to avoid conflict, but on what I actually wanted, what I deserved. "In that case," James said, and I could hear the smile in his voice, "let me know what you need." After I hung up, I sat in the growing twilight, watching the city lights begin to twinkle outside my window. Tomorrow, I would sign papers. Next week, I would own the penthouse directly above Jessica's head. The same penthouse I'd heard her talking about just last month when she thought I was in the bathroom and couldn't hear her phone conversation with her friend Melissa. "God, Mel, you should see this place," she'd said, her voice carrying that particular tone of longing and entitlement I was beginning to recognize. 2 full floors, private elevator, 3 terraces. When we can afford it, that's going to be our home. I mean, can you imagine? Having that much space, that much luxury? Michael's still being conservative with money, but once his mother is out of the picture and we inherit her assets. I'd frozen in the hallway, teacups rattling on the tray I was carrying back to the kitchen. Once his mother is out of the picture. As if I were already dead. As if I were just an inconvenience standing between Jessica and the life she felt she deserved. Now, sipping my tea in the fading light, I smiled for the first time in hours. Jessica wanted the penthouse. Jessica felt entitled to luxury, to space, to a life funded by money she hadn't earned. Jessica was about to discover that wanting something and deserving it were 2 entirely different things. But first, I had some calls to make. Patricia, to finalize the purchase. My lawyer, to ensure everything was properly documented. And maybe, just maybe, I'd start researching moving companies. After all, I was about to become Jessica's upstairs neighbor. The thought filled me with something I hadn't felt in a very long time: anticipation. The moving truck arrived at 7 in the morning on a crisp October Tuesday, rumbling down Madison Avenue like some mechanical beast coming to claim its territory. I watched from across the street, sipping coffee from a paper cup and feeling strangely like a general surveying a battlefield before the first charge. "Mrs. Thompson?" The moving foreman, a weathered man named Tony with kind eyes and calloused hands, approached with a clipboard. "We're ready when you are." I nodded, fishing the penthouse keys from my purse. Patricia had handed them over just yesterday, along with a smile that suggested she knew exactly what kind of game I was playing and thoroughly approved. "The service elevator is around back," I told Tony. "I've already cleared it with building management." What I didn't mention was how the building manager, Mrs. Chen, a sharp-eyed woman who'd been running this place for 20 years, had raised an eyebrow when I'd introduced myself as the new penthouse owner. "You're Michael Thompson's mother," she'd said. Not a question. "I am. And you're moving into 16A. "I am." She'd studied me for a long moment, taking in my sensible shoes and modest coat, clearly trying to reconcile the woman before her with the astronomical price tag of the penthouse. Then she'd smiled, a slow, knowing smile that suggested she'd seen this particular brand of family drama before. "Well," she'd said, handing over the security codes, "this should be interesting." Now, watching the movers unload my life from their truck, I wondered if interesting was quite the right word for what I was about to do. The elevator ride to the 16th floor felt eternal. My stomach churned with an unfamiliar mixture of excitement and guilt. Was I being petty, vindictive, or was I simply, for the first time in years, putting myself first? The elevator doors opened directly into my new foyer, and I stepped into a space that took my breath away. The photos hadn't done it justice. Morning light poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the hardwood floors to gold. The living room stretched out before me like something from a magazine. High ceilings, exposed beams, a fireplace that looked like it could heat a small village. But it was the terrace that made me gasp. I walked to the French doors and stepped outside into my own private piece of sky. Central Park spread out below like a green carpet, the reservoir glittering in the morning sun. I could see joggers on the paths, dog walkers in the sheep meadow, the whole magnificent sprawl of Manhattan stretching toward the horizon. "Ma'am?" Tony appeared behind me. "Where would you like us to start?" I turned back to the apartment, my apartment, and felt something settle into place inside my chest. This wasn't just about Jessica's cruelty or Michael's cowardice. This was about reclaiming myself, about refusing to shrink into the corners of other people's lives. "The master bedroom is upstairs," I said. "Let's start there." By noon, the movers had transformed the empty space into something that looked surprisingly like home. My grandmother's antique dining table sat beneath the chandelier like it had been made for this room. My books lined the built-in shelves, their familiar spines creating a rainbow of memory and comfort. The Waterford crystal, my Waterford crystal, I reminded myself, caught the light from its place of honor in the dining room hutch. I was arranging photographs on the mantelpiece when I heard it. Voices in the hallway, muffled by the heavy doors but unmistakably angry. "Told you this would happen. Didn't know she had that kind of money? Supposed to be ours." Jessica and Michael, having what sounded like the first real fight of their marriage. I pressed my ear to the door, shameless in my eavesdropping. You said she was broke, Jessica's voice sharp with fury. You said all her money was tied up in retirement accounts and life insurance. You said she was living on Social Security and Robert's pension. I thought she was, Michael's voice, smaller, defensive. I never asked about her finances directly. It seemed invasive. Invasive? Jessica's laugh was bitter. Your mother just bought a $3 million penthouse, and you thought asking about her money would be invasive? Are you completely stupid, or just willfully blind? I winced. $3 million. Patricia had gotten me quite a deal. Look, Michael said, and I could hear the exhaustion in his voice. Maybe this is good. Maybe having her own place will give us some space. Maybe we can all just start over. Start over? Jessica's voice rose to a pitch that probably had dogs barking in New Jersey. She's living directly above us, Michael. She probably planned this whole thing. The crying, the victim act, storming out of here Sunday. It was all theater so she could play the wronged mother-in-law while she plotted her revenge. I stepped back from the door, Jessica's words hitting me like cold water. Plotted revenge? Is that what this looked like from the outside? But then I remembered the feeling of my heart cracking in her kitchen, the sound of my son's deliberate silence, the taste of humiliation as I'd walked to the elevator. None of that had been theater. That had been real, raw, devastating. This, buying the penthouse, moving in above them, this might be strategic, but it wasn't revenge. It was survival. She's probably up there right now, Jessica continued, listening to every word we say, planning her next move. God, Michael, don't you see what she's doing? She's trying to control our lives. She wants to make sure we never have any privacy, any independence, any chance to build something that's just ours. I heard footsteps, then the slam of a door. A few minutes later, the elevator chimed, and through my new windows, I watched Michael emerge from the building and disappear down the street, his shoulders hunched against more than just the autumn wind. The building fell quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic and the soft whistle of wind through my new terraces. I stood in my magnificent living room, surrounded by my carefully arranged life, and felt unexpectedly hollow. Was Jessica right? Was I trying to control them? Was this elaborate and expensive revenge disguised as self-empowerment? I walked to the kitchen, a masterpiece of marble and steel that would have made Robert weep with envy, and put the kettle on for tea. As I waited for it to boil, I caught sight of movement on the terrace below. Jessica had come outside and was pacing back and forth like a caged animal, her phone pressed to her ear. I cracked the window and shamelessly listened. "Can't believe this happened," she was saying. "No, Melissa, she definitely planned it. Old women don't just accidentally buy penthouses in their sons' buildings. This is psychological warfare." She paused, listening to whatever Melissa was saying. Of course Michael won't do anything about it. He's terrified of confronting his precious mother. I swear, sometimes I think he's more married to her memory of his father than he is to me. Another pause. No, I can't just leave him. Do you know how much money she actually has? If she can afford this place, her estate is worth serious money. I just need to figure out how to accelerate the inheritance timeline. The kettle's whistle filled my kitchen, sharp and urgent. I turned off the burner with shaking hands, Jessica's words echoing in my ears. Accelerate the inheritance timeline. I looked down at the terrace below, where my daughter-in-law continued her phone conversation, gesturing wildly as she plotted my financial future. Our eyes met for just a moment through the glass, and Jessica's face went white. She ended her call and disappeared back inside, leaving me alone with the wind and a terrible, crystalline understanding of what my life had become. I wasn't the villain in this story, but I wasn't exactly the victim anymore either. I was something else entirely. Something Jessica was about to discover she should have been much more careful about creating. I was a woman with nothing left to lose. The first noise complaint came on Thursday. I was sitting at my new kitchen island, grading papers for the literacy program I volunteered with, when the building manager knocked on my door. Mrs. Chen stood in my doorway with an expression that somehow managed to convey both professional duty and barely concealed amusement. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, consulting her clipboard, "I've received a complaint about excessive noise from your apartment, specifically furniture dragging and loud music between the hours of 6 and 8 a.m. I blinked, genuinely confused. "I'm sorry, what? I don't own a stereo, and I certainly haven't been moving furniture at 6 in the morning." Mrs. Chen's mouth twitched. I didn't think so. You strike me as more of a tea and crosswords at dawn type, but I'm required to investigate all complaints. She peered past me into the apartment, taking in the serene space where morning light played across my grandmother's quilts and the soft classical music drifted from my small radio. Mrs. Chen, I said carefully, who made this complaint? I'm not supposed to say, but given that you're the only person living above apartment 15B, she shrugged eloquently. Jessica, of course. I see. I felt something cold and calculating settle in my chest. Well, please feel free to investigate, though I should mention that I've been awake since 5:30 reading, and the only sound I've made is turning pages. Mrs. Chen made a note on her clipboard. Between you and me, Mrs. Thompson, I've been managing this building for 20 years. I know the difference between legitimate noise complaints and, she paused delicately, other motivations. After she left, I stood at my windows, looking down at the street, processing this new development. Jessica wasn't just angry about my proximity, she was actively trying to make my life difficult. The woman who'd thrown me out of my son's apartment was now attempting to drive me out of my own home. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. Linda, darling, Patricia's voice bubbled through the speaker. How are you settling in? I heard through the building grapevine that there's been some excitement. Excitement is one word for it. I also heard that your downstairs neighbor has been asking questions about your purchase, specifically whether there were any irregularities in the transaction that might be grounds for legal challenge. I sank into my reading chair, the one I'd positioned perfectly to catch the afternoon light. She what? Oh, she was very subtle about it. Asked the doorman if he knew anything about your financing, wondered aloud to Mrs. Chen whether elderly people sometimes make impulsive purchases they can't afford. Nothing actionable, of course, but Patricia's voice sharpened with professional interest. Linda, exactly how much liquid capital do you have access to? The question hung in the air like incense. Patricia had handled the Penthouse purchase, but she didn't know about the rest, the careful investments Robert and I had made over 40 years, the life insurance policies, the inheritance from my parents' estate that had been growing quietly in index funds for decades. Enough, I said simply. Enough for what? I looked around my beautiful apartment, thinking about Jessica's phone conversation yesterday, about her casual mention of accelerating inheritance timelines, about the noise complaint that was really a declaration of war. Enough for whatever comes next. That evening, I decided to test my new freedom. I'd spent so many months being careful, being small, being apologetic for taking up space in the world. But this was my building now too, my home. I had as much right to the common areas as anyone else. I took the elevator down to the 15th floor and knocked on Michael's door. He answered after a long pause, his face cycling through surprise, guilt, and something that might have been relief. Mom. His voice was carefully neutral. I wasn't expecting you. I live upstairs now, I said gently. I thought I should probably mention that. He stepped back, gesturing me inside, and I entered the space that had been the scene of Sunday's humiliation. Everything looked exactly the same. The hardwood floors Robert had helped him choose, the mantelpiece where family photos sat like sentries, the kitchen where Jessica had destroyed me with surgical precision. Where's Jessica? I asked. Yoga class. Michael ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made my heart ache. Mom, about Sunday? You don't need to explain. I settled onto the couch where I'd sat dozens of times before, but now it felt different, foreign. I understand. Do you? He sat across from me, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Because I'm not sure I do. I keep replaying it, wondering if I should have said something, done something. But you didn't. The words hung between us, not accusatory but factual. Michael flinched as if I'd slapped him. She's been under a lot of stress, he said finally. Work. The wedding expenses were still paying off, trying to adjust to married life. Sometimes she lashes out when she feels overwhelmed. I nodded, studying my son's face. When had he learned to make excuses for cruelty? When had he decided that keeping peace was more important than protecting the people he claimed to love? Michael, I said carefully, how much do you know about our family's financial situation? He looked confused. What do you mean? I mean, what did your father and I tell you about money? About investments, savings, inheritance? Nothing, really. Dad always said you were comfortable but not wealthy. that you'd be okay after he was gone, but that I shouldn't expect a big inheritance or anything like that. He said the best thing you could leave me was the education to take care of myself. I felt a rush of love for my dead husband, for his wisdom in teaching our son independence rather than entitlement. But I also felt a stab of something else, realization that my carefully private approach to finances had created a vacuum that Jessica was eager to fill with her own assumptions. And Jessica? What does she think about our financial situation? Michael shifted uncomfortably. Why are you asking? Humor me, he sighed. She thinks you're struggling, living on Social Security and Dad's pension. She's mentioned a few times that she worries about you being able to afford your apartment, medical bills, that kind of thing. I almost laughed. Almost. Jessica thought I was a broke widow, living hand to mouth, which explained her shock at the Penthouse purchase. It also explained her phone call about accelerating inheritance timelines. If she believed I was financially vulnerable, she might think a little pressure could speed up the natural order of things. Michael, I said, standing up, I need you to know something. Your father and I were very careful with money, very strategic. When he died, I inherited not just his pension, but 40 years of compound interest, life insurance policies, and investment gains. My son stared at me, processing this information. The Penthouse wasn't an impulsive purchase. It was a strategic one. I can afford it easily, along with quite a few other things if I choose to buy them. I don't understand, Michael said slowly. Why are you telling me this? I walked to the mantelpiece and picked up a photo of Robert and me from our 25th anniversary, remembering how proud we'd been of the nest egg we were building, how carefully we'd planned for a future that cancer had cut short. Because your wife thinks I'm an obstacle, standing between her and an inheritance that doesn't exist in the form she imagines. And I want you to understand what that means. I set down the photo and looked directly at my son. It means she married you for the wrong reasons, Michael, and it means she's about to make some very poor decisions based on very bad assumptions. The elevator chimed in the hallway, followed by the sound of heels on hardwood. Jessica was home from yoga class. I smiled at my son, whose face had gone pale with understanding. I should go, I said. But Michael, I'll be upstairs if you need to talk. As I waited for the elevator, I heard voices rising behind the closed door. Jessica's sharp with anger, Michael's low with questions he'd never thought to ask before. The elevator carried me back to my penthouse, to my sanctuary, to my perfect view of the city spread out below like a chessboard. Jessica wanted to play games? She had no idea who she was playing with. The second noise complaint came on Monday, followed by a complaint about cooking odors on Tuesday, and a formal letter about inappropriate use of common areas on Wednesday. By Thursday, I was beginning to admire Jessica's creativity, if not her accuracy. I was particularly amused by the cooking complaint, since I'd made nothing more aromatic than chamomile tea all week. But Mrs. Chen dutifully investigated each report with the weary professionalism of someone who'd seen this particular dance before. She's escalating, Mrs. Chen observed after the third visit, accepting the cup of coffee I'd offered. We stood at my kitchen island, looking out at Central Park, where autumn was painting the trees in shades of gold and crimson. In my experience, this usually means she's feeling cornered. Cornered by what? I haven't done anything except exist in my own apartment. Mrs. Chen smiled. Sometimes existing in the right place at the right time is the most powerful thing a person can do. She was right, of course. I hadn't retaliated against Jessica's harassment campaign, hadn't filed counter complaints, hadn't even mentioned the situation to Michael. I'd simply lived my life, quietly, peacefully, visibly. And apparently, that was driving Jessica to distraction. That afternoon, as I arranged flowers from the farmer's market on my dining table, I heard voices on the terrace below. Through my windows, I could see Jessica pacing while talking on her phone, her gestures sharp with frustration. I opened the French doors to my own terrace and stepped outside, ostensibly to water the small herb garden I'd planted in terracotta pots. The October air was crisp and clean, carrying the sense of autumn and possibility. "Can't take much more of this, Mel," Jessica was saying, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "She's doing it on purpose. The moving in, the noise complaints she knows are fake, the way she just lurks up there like some kind of spider." I paused in my watering, a smile tugging at my lips. Spider? I rather liked that. "No, Michael won't do anything," Jessica continued. "He's completely under her spell. Yesterday, he actually asked me why I thought his mother was broke, as if that old bat hasn't been playing poor to manipulate us this whole time. I set down my watering can and leaned against the terrace railing, no longer pretending I wasn't listening. Of course I don't know how much she actually has, Jessica snapped. But if she can afford that penthouse, it's more than she let on. Which means she's been lying to us, making us feel sorry for her while she planned this whole revenge scheme. The word revenge again. Jessica seemed incapable of imagining that someone might make a decision based on their own needs rather than her convenience. Look, I have a plan, she said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. There's this private investigator my divorce lawyer friend recommended. He specializes in financial investigations for estate planning. If I can prove she's hiding assets or manipulating her will to cut us out, I gripped the railing, my knuckles going white. A private investigator. She was actually going to hire someone to dig into my finances, looking for evidence of, what exactly? The crime of being more financially secure than she'd assumed? Meet him tomorrow. Cash payment, completely confidential. By next week, I'll know exactly what we're dealing with. The call ended, and Jessica disappeared back inside. I stood on my terrace for a long time, watching the sun set over Central Park, and processing this new development. Jessica wasn't just angry or frustrated. She was actively investigating me, looking for leverage, weapons, ways to undermine my credibility with Michael. She thought she was playing chess, but she was actually playing with dynamite. That evening, I called my lawyer. Robert Steinberg had been our family attorney for 20 years, handling everything from real estate transactions to Robert's estate planning. He was a small, precise man with the kind of methodical mind that found loopholes the way other people found parking spaces. Linda, he said warmly, how's the new apartment? Patricia tells me you got quite a deal. It's lovely, Robert, but I'm calling about a different matter. I need to discuss my estate planning. There was a pause. Is everything all right? You're not ill, are you? I'm perfectly healthy, but I want to make some changes to my will, and I want to discuss the implications of someone conducting a financial investigation into my assets. Another pause, longer this time. Linda, what exactly is going on? I told him everything. Jessica's behavior, the penthouse purchase, the noise complaints, and today's overheard phone conversation about hiring a private investigator. Robert listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds that suggested he was taking notes. Well, he said finally, this is certainly interesting. From a legal standpoint, your daughter-in-law has every right to hire a private investigator as long as they don't engage in any illegal activities like breaking into accounts or impersonating officials. Your financial information is largely public record anyway. Property purchases, tax assessments, that sort of thing. So she'll be able to find out about the investments, the life insurance payouts, the broad strokes, yes. She'll discover that you're considerably more wealthy than she assumed. But Linda, his voice sharpened with professional interest, why does that concern you? You've done nothing wrong. It doesn't concern me, I said slowly. I'm just trying to understand what her next move might be once she realizes the scope of her miscalculation. Ah, Robert was quiet for a moment. You know, there is one thing that might interest you. Given what you've told me about her comments regarding inheritance timelines, and now this investigation, yes? If someone were to challenge your will or your competency to make financial decisions, there would be a significant legal burden of proof. Courts don't take kindly to family members who seem more interested in inheritance than the well-being of their relatives. I felt something click into place in my mind. What would constitute proof of such mercenary interests? Well, documented evidence of someone investigating your finances for personal gain, rather than legitimate concern for your welfare. Recorded statements about accelerating inheritance or expressing anger about gift-giving or financial independence, that sort of thing. I see. Linda, Robert's voice carried a note of warning. I hope you're not planning anything dramatic. Not dramatic, no, just thorough. After I hung up, I sat in my reading chair watching the city lights twinkle below, thinking about Jessica's private investigator and what he would discover. My investment portfolio, carefully built over 40 years. The life insurance policies that had paid out when Robert died, the inheritance from my parents' estate, the real estate investments we'd made in the 80s that were now worth 10 times their original value. Jessica thought she was investigating a vulnerable widow who might be hiding modest assets. Instead, she was about to discover that she'd declared war on a woman with a net worth approaching $8 million and access to the kind of legal firepower that money could buy. But more than that, she was about to create a paper trail of her own mercenary interests that would be very difficult to explain if anyone ever questioned her motives. I picked up my phone and called a number I'd found online earlier, a discreet security service that specialized in protecting high net worth individuals from various threats. "I'd like to discuss your surveillance services," I told the receptionist. "I believe someone is planning to investigate my financial situation, and I'd like to document their activities for legal purposes." By Friday, Jessica would have her private investigator. By the following Friday, I'd have documentation of every conversation, every meeting, every attempt to dig into my personal finances. Jessica wanted to know exactly who she was dealing with. Soon, she'd find out. But by then, it would be far too late for her to change course. The game was no longer about a penthouse or hurt feelings or family dinners. The game was about survival, and I'd been playing it longer than she'd been alive. The surveillance report arrived the following Thursday in a manila envelope marked "Confidential." I opened it in my kitchen while the morning coffee brewed, spreading the photographs and typed pages across the marble counter like pieces of a puzzle I was finally ready to solve. Jessica had met with the private investigator twice. The first meeting, captured in grainy photographs outside a Starbucks on Lexington Avenue, showed her sliding a thick envelope across a small table. Cash payment, just as she'd promised Melissa. The second meeting, 3 days later, showed the investigator handing her a folder while she leaned forward eagerly, her face bright with anticipation. But it was the transcript of their conversation that made my coffee grow cold in my hands. My security team had somehow managed to record their second meeting, and reading Jessica's words in black and white was like watching a stranger describe someone I'd never met. "So the old bat really does have money," Jessica had said, her voice crackling through the hidden microphone. "How much are we talking about?" "Based on public records and financial footprints, I'd estimate liquid assets in the 7 to 8 million range," the investigator had replied. "Property holdings, investment accounts, life insurance payouts. She's been very smart with money over the years." 8 million. Jessica's voice had gone quiet, calculating. "And Michael thinks she's living on Social Security. There's more. She's made several large charitable donations over the past year, but nothing that would impact her overall net worth significantly. She's also been consulting with estate planning attorneys." Estate planning? The excitement in Jessica's voice was audible even through the poor audio quality. Like updating her will? Possibly. Though at her age and wealth level, that's fairly standard practice. I set down the transcript, my hands trembling slightly. Jessica wasn't just investigating my finances, she was actively planning for my death. Not wishing for it exactly, but certainly anticipating it with the kind of enthusiasm most people reserved for vacation planning. The final page of the report contained information that made my blood run cold. Jessica had asked the investigator to research expedited probate procedures and contesting mental competency in elderly individuals. She wasn't just interested in my money, she was researching ways to get it. I walked to my windows, looking down at the street where normal people were living normal lives, unaware that 15 floors above them, a woman was discovering exactly how far her daughter-in-law was willing to go for financial gain. My phone rang, interrupting my dark thoughts. "Linda?" Michael's voice was strained, exhausted. "Are you free this afternoon? I'd like to come up and talk." "Of course. Is everything all right?" "I'm not sure. Jessica's been different lately. Distracted, secretive, and she keeps asking strange questions about you." "What kind of questions?" "About your health, your memory, whether I've noticed any changes in your behavior since Dad died. She seems convinced that you're not thinking clearly." I closed my eyes, feeling pieces of Jessica's strategy click into place. If she couldn't prove I was hiding money maliciously, she'd try to prove I was mentally incompetent to manage it. A grieving widow, isolated and confused, making poor financial decisions that needed family intervention. "I'll put coffee on," I told Michael. He arrived an hour later, looking like he'd aged a decade in the 2 weeks since Jessica's explosion in their kitchen. We sat in my living room, surrounded by the comfortable familiarity of family photographs and my grandmother's quilts, while afternoon light painted golden rectangles on the hardwood floors. "Tell me about the questions," I said gently. Michael ran his hands through his hair, that familiar gesture that meant he was trying to organize thoughts he didn't want to think. She asks if you seem confused when we talk, whether you repeat yourself or forget things we've discussed, if I think you're making rational decisions about money and living arrangements. And what do you tell her? The truth, that you seem sharper than ever, actually. More focused, more purposeful than you've been since Dad died. He looked around my apartment, taking in the carefully arranged space, the evidence of a life being lived intentionally. This place, for instance, Jessica keeps saying it was an impulsive purchase, that you couldn't possibly afford it, that someone must have taken advantage of you. But looking at it now, what do you see? I see someone who knew exactly what she wanted and had the means to get it. He met my eyes, and I saw a spark of the intelligent boy who'd grown up to be an accountant, someone trained to recognize patterns in numbers and behavior. Mom, exactly how much money do you have? I'd been dreading this question and anticipating it in equal measure. My son deserved the truth, but the truth would change everything between us. Once he knew the scope of my assets, he'd never be able to unknow it. He'd never be able to look at Jessica's behavior as mere stress or adjustment difficulties. He'd see it for what it was, calculated greed. More than Jessica realizes, I said carefully, and apparently more than you realize too. I told him about the investments, the life insurance, the inheritance from my parents that had been compounding for decades. I showed him the portfolio statements Robert Steinberg had prepared, watching his face change as he processed the numbers. Jesus, Mom. His voice was barely a whisper. You're wealthy, yes. Your father and I lived modestly because we enjoyed simple things, not because we had to. We traveled when we wanted to, bought what we needed, and saved the rest. We never talked about money because we never needed to worry about it. Michael was quiet for a long time, staring at the financial statements in his hands. When he finally looked up, his expression was a mixture of awe and something that might have been fear. Does Jessica know about this? She does now. She hired a private investigator to look into my finances. The color drained from Michael's face. She did what? I handed him the surveillance photos and transcripts, watching as he read through Jessica's recorded conversations. With each page, his expression grew darker, more horrified. The old bat, he read aloud, his voice tight with disgust. Expedited probate procedures, mental competency challenges. He set down the papers and looked at me with eyes that held a lifetime of disillusionment. She's not just interested in your money, Mom. She's planning for your death. Yes. And she thinks I don't know. She thinks I'm some kind of useful idiot who'll help her challenge your will or have you declared incompetent. He stood up abruptly, pacing to the windows. How long has she been playing me? I don't know, sweetheart. Maybe from the beginning. Maybe it developed over time. But Michael, I joined him at the windows, looking down at the street where Jessica would soon return from whatever errand had taken her out this afternoon. I need you to understand something important. He turned to me, waiting. This isn't just about money anymore. Jessica has created a paper trail of intent to defraud an elderly person. She's documented her own mercenary interests and researched ways to circumvent my legal rights. If she follows through on any of this, she could go to prison. Yes, but more importantly, she could destroy you in the process. Financial elder abuse investigations don't just target the primary perpetrator. They look at anyone who might have been involved or who benefited from the scheme. Michael's face went ashen as he realized what I was telling him. If Jessica moved forward with her plans, his own reputation, career, and legal standing could be jeopardized by association. What do I do? He whispered. I looked down at Jessica emerging from a taxi on the street below, her arms full of shopping bags, her face bright with the satisfaction of someone whose plans were proceeding smoothly. You have a choice to make, I said quietly. You can warn her off, try to save your marriage by explaining what I know and hoping she'll abandon her scheme. Or you can help me document exactly how far she's willing to go. My son stared down at his wife, processing the full scope of her betrayal, the magnitude of her miscalculation. If I help you, he said finally, our marriage is over. Michael, your marriage is already over. Jessica just hasn't told you yet. Below us, Jessica disappeared into the building, probably heading home to plan her next move in a game where she'd already lost without knowing it. Michael stood at my windows for a long time, watching the spot where his wife had vanished. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady with the kind of resolve I hadn't heard since he was a boy, promising to take care of his sick father. "What do you need me to do?" The recording device was smaller than a button, practically invisible when tucked into the seam of Michael's shirt pocket. The security specialist who'd installed it, a soft-spoken woman named Sarah with the kind of unremarkable face that made her perfect for surveillance work, had assured us it would capture clear audio from up to 15 feet away. "Just act normal," she'd instructed Michael as we tested the equipment in my living room. "Don't lean in, don't speak louder than usual, don't do anything that might make her suspicious. Let her talk, and she'll tell you everything you need to know." That had been 2 days ago. Now, watching my son prepare to go downstairs to his own apartment, to his own wife, wearing a wire like some character in a crime drama, I felt the full weight of what we were doing. "Are you sure about this?" I asked for the dozenth time. "Once we have her on record, there's no going back, I know." Michael adjusted his tie with hands that trembled slightly. "But Mom, I need to hear her say it. I need to know if the woman I married ever existed, or if this is who she's always been." I understood. Sometimes the truth was the only thing that could cut through the fog of denial and hope that kept us tied to people who were destroying us. Michael hugged me, the first real embrace we'd shared since that awful Sunday 2 weeks ago, and headed for the elevator. I watched from my windows as he crossed the street and bought flowers from the corner vendor, preparing for his performance as the loving, unsuspecting husband. Then I settled into my reading chair with a cup of tea and waited for the show to begin. The text came 20 minutes later. "She's taking the bait." I'd suggested the strategy during one of our planning sessions with Sarah. Michael would tell Jessica that he'd been thinking about our family's future, about children, about the security that a substantial inheritance would provide. He'd plant the seed that maybe, just maybe, I was sicker than I appeared, that my recent spending and erratic behavior might indicate early dementia. It was a cruel fiction, but it was exactly what Jessica wanted to hear. My phone buzzed with an incoming text from Sarah, who was monitoring the audio feed from a van parked down the street. "She's talking. This is better than we hoped." An hour later, Michael returned to my apartment with a transcript that made my hands shake as I read it. Jessica had taken the bait like a starving fish. "I knew something was wrong with her," she'd said, her voice animated with excitement. "Normal people don't buy $3 million apartments on impulse. And the way she's been acting, so secretive, so strange. I think the grief finally caught up with her brain." Michael had played his part perfectly, expressing concern about my mental state while subtly encouraging Jessica to share her thoughts about our family's future. "Maybe we should talk to her doctor," he'd suggested, "or a lawyer. If Mom really is developing dementia, someone needs to protect her assets before she gives them all away to charity or gets scammed by con artists." The transcript showed Jessica's response in black and white. "A lawyer is exactly what we need. I've already been researching elder law attorneys who specialize in competency cases. If we can demonstrate that she's not capable of managing her own affairs." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we could petition for guardianship, take control of her finances before she hurts herself or us. Michael, if your mother really has $8 million and she's losing her mind, we have a responsibility to protect that money, for her own good and for our future children." Michael had pressed further, asking what would happen to me in a guardianship scenario. "Oh, she'd be taken care of," Jessica had said dismissively. "Probably in a nice assisted living facility where she'd have professional supervision. Someplace where she couldn't make any more impulsive purchases or fall victim to scammers. She'd actually be happier not having to worry about all those complicated financial decisions." The conversation had continued for another 30 minutes, with Jessica outlining her vision of our family's future in horrifying detail. She'd already identified a facility, very exclusive, very discreet, where inconvenient relatives could be housed while their assets were managed by more capable hands. She'd researched the legal requirements for declaring someone mentally incompetent, the timeline for guardianship proceedings, even the costs involved. "The beauty of it is, we'd be using her own money to pay for everything," she'd explained to Michael. "The legal fees, the facility costs, even our own compensation for managing her affairs. It's all perfectly legal as long as we can prove she's not competent to make her own decisions." I set down the transcript and walked to my windows, looking out at the city where thousands of families were probably sharing dinner, helping with homework, planning vacations, normal families doing normal things, unaware that 15 floors below them, a woman had just outlined her plans to destroy her husband's mother for financial gain. The cruelest part wasn't the money. Money could be replaced, protected, redistributed. The cruelest part was the efficiency of her planning, the casual way she'd discussed warehousing me in an institution while she spent my life savings on her own comfort. Michael appeared at my door an hour later, his face gray with exhaustion and something deeper, the particular kind of devastation that comes from discovering that everything you believed about your life was a lie. "Sarah says the recording is perfect," he said, collapsing into my sofa like a man who'd run a marathon. "Clear audio, detailed confession, enough evidence to prosecute her for elder abuse conspiracy if she tries to follow through. How are you doing with all this?" He was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. "I keep thinking about our wedding day. The vows we made, the promises about in sickness and in health, for better or worse. I thought she meant them. Maybe she did. At the time. No." His voice was flat, certain. "This level of planning doesn't happen overnight. The investigation, the legal research, the facility she'd already picked out. She's been working on this for months, maybe longer. Which means she was planning this before she threw me out of your apartment. She was planning this before Dad died." Michael looked up at me with eyes full of terrible understanding. "That's why she married me, isn't it? She saw a family with money and decided to position herself to inherit it." I thought about Jessica's eagerness to marry quickly, her interest in family financial discussions, the way she'd always steered conversations toward inheritance and estate planning. The signs had been there, but grief and hope had made us blind to them. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. Don't apologize. I'm the one who brought her into our lives. I'm the one who was so desperate to fill the emptiness after Dad died that I convinced myself her interest was love instead of greed." Yeah. We sat in comfortable silence as the city lights began to twinkle outside my windows. Finally, Michael spoke again. "What happens now?" I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Robert Steinberg's number. "Now we make sure Jessica gets exactly what she's earned." "Which is?" I thought about the surveillance photos, the recorded conversations, the documented evidence of a calculated scheme to defraud an elderly widow. I thought about nursing homes and guardianship petitions, and the casual cruelty of someone who'd planned to warehouse me while spending my money. "Nothing," I said, pressing Robert's number. "Jessica gets absolutely nothing. But first, she's going to discover what happens when you try to con someone who's been playing this game longer than you've been alive." The phone rang once before Robert answered. "Linda, this is late for you to be calling. I know. But I have some evidence I need you to review, and I think we need to discuss my estate planning again." "Oh?" "Yes. I want to make sure my assets are completely protected from any future claims. And Robert, I think it's time Jessica learned that some games have consequences." The envelope arrived by courier on a Tuesday morning, thick cream paper with Robert Steinberg's law firm letterhead embossed in elegant gold letters. I watched from my penthouse windows as Jessica signed for it at the building's front desk, her face curious and slightly annoyed at being interrupted during what appeared to be another phone conversation with Melissa. She tore it open right there in the lobby, and I had a perfect view as her expression changed from mild irritation to confusion to something approaching panic. The papers fluttered from her hands, scattering across the marble floor like autumn leaves. My phone rang 30 seconds later. "What the hell is this?" Jessica's voice was shrill, barely controlled. "What kind of sick game are you playing?" "I'm not sure what you're referring to," I said calmly, settling into my reading chair with my morning tea. "You'll have to be more specific. Don't play dumb with me. This cease and desist order. This ridiculous claim about elder abuse and financial fraud. Are you completely insane?" I glanced at the copy of Robert's letter on my coffee table. 20 pages of meticulously crafted legal language that outlined exactly what Jessica had been doing and exactly what would happen if she continued. The language was dense, but the message was crystal clear. We had evidence of her scheme, and any further attempts to investigate my finances or question my mental competency would result in immediate criminal prosecution. "I'm not insane, Jessica. But you might want to ask yourself whether hiring a private investigator to research ways to have your husband's mother declared mentally incompetent constitutes a rational decision." The silence on the other end of the line was so complete, I wondered if she'd hung up. Then I heard her breathing, rapid and shallow, like someone trying not to hyperventilate. "You've been spying on me," she whispered. "I've been protecting myself. There's a difference. This is entrapment. This is harassment." "No, Jessica. Entrapment would be if I'd encouraged you to commit a crime. Harassment would be if I'd contacted you repeatedly after you asked me to stop. What this is documentation." I heard the elevator chime through the phone, then the sound of Jessica's heels clicking rapidly across hardwood floors. "Michael!" Her voice was distant, but audible. "Michael, get out here right now." "He's not home," I told her. "He had an early meeting with a client. But when he gets back, I'm sure he'll be very interested to discuss the legal implications of your research activities." Another silence, longer this time. When Jessica spoke again, her voice had changed completely. Gone was the shrillness, replaced by something cold and calculating. "You think you're so smart, don't you? Sitting up there in your expensive apartment, playing puppet master with all your money and your lawyers and your surveillance teams. I think I'm adequately prepared to protect my interests. Yes. Well, here's something your money can't protect you from, Linda." Jessica's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow seemed more threatening than her earlier screaming. "I know things about this family. Things Michael never told you. Things that would destroy your precious memory of your saint of a husband." My teacup rattled against its saucer as I set it down. "I beg your pardon? You heard me? Robert wasn't the devoted family man you think he was. All those business trips, all those late nights at the office. You really think he was working the whole time?" Ice formed in my stomach, but I kept my voice steady. "Jessica, I'd be very careful about making accusations you can't prove." "Can't prove?" She laughed, high and wild. "I can prove plenty. Michael told me everything when he was drunk after your anniversary party last year. All about Daddy's little indiscretions, about the woman in Chicago, about the apartment Robert kept for his weekend visits." The world tilted sideways. Robert's quarterly trips to Chicago, consulting work with a firm there, always extending into weekends because it was more efficient to stay over than to fly back and forth. 40 years of marriage, and I'd never questioned those trips, never thought to question them. "You're lying." "Am I?" "Ask Michael. Ask him about the receipts he found when he was settling Robert's estate. Ask him about the credit card statements for restaurants Robert never took you to, hotels he stayed in when he was supposedly working 16-hour days." My hand was shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you want to play games, Linda. I can play games too. You want to destroy my marriage with your surveillance and your legal threats? I can destroy your memories just as easily." The line went dead. I sat in my beautiful apartment, surrounded by 40 years of carefully collected memories, and felt them all crumble to dust. The anniversary gifts Robert had brought back from Chicago. The business associates I'd never met, never been introduced to, despite decades of supposedly important consulting work. The way he'd always been tired and distant after those trips, needing a day or two to settle back into family life. No, I wouldn't accept this. Jessica was desperate, cornered, lashing out with whatever weapon she could find. She was lying because the truth, her truth about financial fraud and elder abuse, had been exposed, and now she needed to wound me badly enough to regain the upper hand. But even as I told myself this, doubt crept in like poison. Details I'd never questioned suddenly seemed significant. Robert's insistence on handling his own travel arrangements, the way he'd always paid cash for things in Chicago, claiming it was simpler for business expenses, his reluctance to talk about his work there, dismissing my interest with vague comments about boring technical consultations. My phone rang again, and I answered without looking at the caller ID. "Mom?" Michael's voice was tight with concern. "I just got off the phone with Jessica. She's saying some pretty awful things. About Robert." "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "Mom, we need to talk. Can I come up?" 20 minutes later, my son sat across from me in my living room, looking like he was about to perform surgery without anesthesia. In his hands was a manila folder I recognized from when he'd handled his father's estate. "I never wanted you to know about this," he said quietly. I thought, what was the point? Dad was gone. You were grieving, and this would only hurt you for no good reason." He opened the folder and pulled out credit card statements, hotel receipts, restaurant bills. Evidence of a life Robert had lived separate from our family, separate from me. Her name was Catherine Morrison, Michael said, his voice barely audible. She was a paralegal at the consulting firm. They were together for almost 15 years, Mom. 15 years. Not an affair, not a momentary weakness, but a parallel life. A second relationship that had lasted longer than some marriages. Did you love her? I asked, and it took me a moment to realize I'd spoken to the papers in my hands instead of to Michael. I don't know. I never met her, never talked to her. But Mom, he reached across the table and took my hand. The consulting work was real. Dad really did help that firm with their technical projects. It wasn't just a cover story. But Catherine was real too. Yes, I looked at the receipts, the evidence of dinners for two, hotel rooms with king-size beds, weekend getaways that Robert had never mentioned, 15 years of Fridays extending into Sundays, of business trips that had been something more than business. How did Jessica know? I told her. Michael's voice was heavy with guilt. Last year, after Dad's anniversary, I'd had too much to drink, and I was angry about having to keep his secrets even after he was dead. I said things I shouldn't have said, and she saved that information, filed it away for future use. Apparently, I sat back in my chair, processing this new reality. My marriage hadn't been what I thought it was. My husband hadn't been who I thought he was. But strangely, the revelation didn't devastate me the way Jessica had expected it to. Instead, it clarified things. Michael, I said finally, your father's choices were his own. Whatever he did or didn't do, whoever he loved or thought he loved, doesn't change who I am or what I'm worth. Mom, and it certainly doesn't change the fact that your wife tried to commit elder fraud. Michael blinked, clearly taken aback by my calm response. Jessica thinks she found my weakness, I continued. She thinks discovering Robert's affair will break me, make me too emotional to think clearly, too devastated to fight back effectively. Won't it? I looked at my son. This good man who'd tried to protect me from painful truths, who'd married a woman who collected secrets like weapons, who'd spent 2 weeks helping me document his own wife's crimes. No, sweetheart, it won't. What will you do? I picked up my phone and scrolled to Robert Steinberg's number. I'm going to finish what we started. Jessica wanted to play dirty. She just taught me exactly how dirty I'm willing to play. The phone rang twice before Robert answered. Linda, how did she take the cease and desist? About as well as expected. But Robert, we need to escalate. I want criminal charges filed, and I want them filed today. Are you certain? Once we go down that path, I'm certain. It's time Jessica learned that some games have consequences she never imagined. I looked out at my city, my view, my home that Jessica had coveted and tried to steal. She wanted a war? She was about to get one. The police arrived at 10:37 on a Thursday morning. 2 detectives in unremarkable suits who looked like they'd stepped from a television drama about financial crimes. I watched from my penthouse windows as they entered the building, already knowing their destination. Detective Martinez, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, had called me an hour earlier to confirm their appointment with Jessica. The charges were officially filed: conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse, attempting to defraud a vulnerable adult, and criminal investigation of protected financial information. Mrs. Thompson, Detective Martinez had explained, we've reviewed all the evidence your attorney provided. The recorded conversations, the private investigator receipts, the documented research into competency proceedings. It's a solid case. We just need to conduct the formal interview. Now, watching those same detectives disappear into the elevator, I felt an unexpected wave of sadness. Not for Jessica, she'd earned whatever was coming, but for the family dinners that would never happen again, for the grandchildren I'd probably never have, for the simple dream of growing old, surrounded by people who loved me for who I was rather than what I owned. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael. I'm on my way up. Jessica just called screaming about police. He arrived 15 minutes later, pale and shaken, still wearing the tie I'd helped him choose when he'd started his accounting firm 3 years ago, back when our biggest worry had been whether he'd have enough clients to pay his office rent. They arrested her, he said without preamble, slumping onto my sofa like a man who'd just run a marathon. Not formally, but they took her to the station for questioning. Her lawyer, the one she hired for the estate planning research, he's meeting them there. I set down my teacup carefully, surprised by how little satisfaction I felt. For weeks, I'd been building toward this moment, documenting Jessica's crimes, gathering evidence, preparing for the confrontation that would finally expose her true nature. But now that it was happening, all I felt was tired. How are you holding up? I don't know. Michael rubbed his face with both hands. Part of me is relieved. Finally, it's all out in the open. No more pretending, no more walking on eggshells, no more wondering if I'm imagining things. And the other part? The other part is terrified about what happens next. Even if she doesn't go to prison, our marriage is over. The woman I thought I loved never existed. She was just a character Jessica played to get close to our family's money. We sat in silence for a while, watching the city move through its rhythms, 15 floors below. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that in one penthouse apartment, a family was falling apart with the precision of a controlled demolition. I keep thinking about Dad, Michael said eventually. About what you found out yesterday. About Catherine. That's different, is it? How do I know what's real anymore? How do I trust my own judgment when I've been so wrong about everything? I looked at my son, really looked at him, seeing not the successful accountant or the disappointed husband, but the boy who'd held my hand during thunderstorms and helped me plant tomatoes in our tiny urban garden. Your father's affair doesn't erase 40 years of marriage, I said slowly. It changes how I understand some things, but it doesn't invalidate everything we shared. Love isn't a zero-sum game, Michael. People can love more than one person, in different ways, at different times. But Jessica never loved you at all. That's the difference. Your father loved me and apparently loved Catherine too. It's messy and painful, and not what I would have chosen, but it's human. What Jessica did was calculated predation. Michael was quiet for a long time, processing this distinction. Finally, he spoke again. What happens to me now? If Jessica goes to prison, if this becomes public, my business, my reputation. I'd been thinking about this too. Financial crimes investigations were public record. Michael's name would be connected to the case, not as a perpetrator, but as a victim's family member. Still, in the small world of Manhattan accounting, reputation was everything. I have an idea about that, I said, but it depends on how willing you are to make a fresh start. What kind of fresh start? I pulled out the folder I'd been preparing for the past week, documents I'd hoped I wouldn't need, but had prepared anyway. Estate planning papers, business partnership proposals, trust fund documentation. I'm 78 years old, Michael. I don't need $8 million for the rest of my life. I need security, comfort, and the peace of mind that comes from knowing my assets are protected and will be used wisely. I handed him the papers. I'm proposing to restructure my estate as a family trust, with you as the primary trustee and beneficiary. The trust would fund a new consulting practice, your consulting practice, specializing in financial protection for elderly clients. Michael stared at the documents, his expressions cycling through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been hope. You'd use your experience with Jessica's scheme as a case study, I continued. Help other families recognize and prevent elder financial abuse. Turn your painful education into something that helps people. This would make me wealthy, independent. Yes, and it would give you a legitimate reason to distance yourself from this situation professionally. You'd be the victim's son who turned his trauma into advocacy, not the husband of a woman who tried to defraud his mother. But what about you? This is your money, your security. I laughed, a sound that surprised us both with its genuine warmth. Sweetheart, I just bought a $3 million penthouse without blinking. I think I can manage on whatever's left. My phone rang, interrupting our conversation. Detective Martinez's number appeared on the screen. Mrs. Thompson, the interview is complete. Your daughter-in-law has been formally charged. Given the evidence and her lack of prior record, she'll likely be released on bail this afternoon. But there will be conditions. No contact with you, no access to any joint financial accounts, no attempts to influence witnesses. When will this go to trial? Probably not for several months. These cases take time to build. But Mrs. Thompson, I should warn you, her lawyer is already talking about a plea bargain. She might try to claim she was protecting you from financial exploitation, that her intentions were benevolent. I thought about Jessica's recorded words, her casual discussion of warehousing me in an assisted living facility while she spent my money, her research into accelerated probate procedures. Detective, Do you believe that defense will be successful? Between you and me? No. The evidence is too clear, too detailed. She documented her own criminal intent too thoroughly. But trials are unpredictable, and juries sometimes sympathize with young women who claim they were trying to help elderly relatives. I understand. There is one other thing. We found additional evidence during our investigation. Email correspondence with the private investigator discussing timeline acceleration and methods for expediting inheritance procedures. Your daughter-in-law wasn't just planning financial fraud, Mrs. Thompson. She was researching ways to expedite your passing. The words hung in the air like smoke. Expedite my passing, as if my death were a business problem to be solved efficiently. I see. We'll be in touch as the case develops. And Mrs. Thompson, you did the right thing. People like your daughter-in-law count on family loyalty and elderly vulnerability to protect them from consequences. You refused to be a victim. After I hung up, Michael and I sat in silence, processing the full scope of what Jessica had planned. Not just theft, but something much darker. She wanted you dead, Michael whispered. She wanted my money. My death was just the most convenient way to get it. How can someone think like that? How can someone plan something like that? I looked out at my beautiful view, at the city full of people living complicated, messy, human lives. Some of them were probably struggling with impossible choices, grinding poverty, desperate circumstances that might make financial crime seem like the only option. Jessica wasn't one of those people. She'd had choices, opportunities, a comfortable life. She'd chosen greed over love, calculation over compassion, crime over character. I don't know, I told my son, but I know this. She chose the wrong target. What do we do now? I picked up the trust documents and handed them back to Michael. Now we build something better, something honest, something that honors the people we actually are instead of the people others think we should be. Michael looked at the papers in his hands. His future, his independence, his chance to start over with integrity intact. Are you sure about this, Mom? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Outside my windows, the city glittered in the afternoon sun, full of possibilities and promise. Full of life being lived by people brave enough to start over when they had to. People like us. Spring arrived in Central Park with an explosion of cherry blossoms and possibility. From my terrace, I could see the conservatory garden where families were spreading picnic blankets and children were chasing bubbles through the warm air. It had been 6 months since Jessica's arrest, and the world had settled into a new rhythm, quieter, more honest, infinitely more peaceful. The plea bargain had been finalized in February. Jessica accepted a charge of attempted elder financial abuse in exchange for 2 years of probation, community service, and mandatory restitution. Though since she'd never actually stolen anything, the restitution was symbolic. More importantly, she'd signed a comprehensive non-contact agreement that extended not just to me, but to any attempt to interfere with my financial affairs for the rest of my life. She looked smaller in court, Michael had told me after the sentencing, like someone had let all the air out of her. I'd chosen not to attend. Some endings don't require witnesses, just acceptance. The divorce had been swift and clean. Jessica had moved back to her mother's house in Connecticut, and according to Michael's lawyer, she was working as a dental hygienist while trying to rebuild a life that no longer included delusions of inherited wealth. I wished her well, in the abstract way one might wish well for a natural disaster that had finally moved on to trouble someone else's neighborhood. Michael had thrived in ways that surprised us both. The consulting practice I'd funded was already profitable, with a client list that included 3 major law firms specializing in elder care. His expertise in recognizing and preventing family financial fraud had made him something of a minor celebrity in legal circles. Last month, he'd been interviewed for an article in the Journal of Elder Law about warning signs families should watch for. The most dangerous predators, he'd told the interviewer, are the ones who have legitimate access to your life. They know your routines, your vulnerabilities, your assets. They use love and family loyalty as weapons, and by the time their targets realize what's happening, significant damage has already been done. I'd framed that article and hung it in my guest room, the room Michael used when he stayed overnight, which was becoming more frequent as we rebuilt our relationship on a foundation of honesty rather than obligation. This morning, he was arriving for our weekly brunch, a tradition we'd established after the divorce was finalized. But today was special. Today, he was bringing someone. Her name is Sarah, he'd told me over the phone, nervous in the way of adult children introducing new partners to their parents. She's a librarian at Columbia, specializes in historical archives. She's different from Jessica in every way imaginable. I smiled, arranging fresh peonies in the vase on my dining table. Different from Jessica was exactly what Michael needed. The elevator chimed at exactly 11 o'clock. Punctuality was another trait Michael had inherited from his father. And I opened my door to find my son standing next to a woman with gentle brown eyes and prematurely gray hair twisted into a loose bun. She wore a simple blue dress and carried a bottle of wine that suggested thoughtful consideration rather than expensive taste. "Mom," Michael said, his voice warm with genuine happiness, "I'd like you to meet Sarah Chen." "Mrs. Thompson," Sarah said, stepping forward with a smile that reached her eyes. "Michael has told me so much about you and about your beautiful home." I liked her immediately. There was no calculation in her expression, no inventory-taking glance around my penthouse, no subtle assessment of wealth and possibility, just genuine warmth and the kind of nervous energy that comes from wanting to make a good impression for the right reasons. "Please, call me Linda, and welcome." We spent the morning on my terrace, sharing stories and watching the park come alive with weekend energy. Sarah was indeed different from Jessica in every conceivable way. She asked thoughtful questions about my volunteer work with the literacy program, shared amusing anecdotes about her research into 19th century women's diaries, and displayed the kind of intellectual curiosity that made conversation a pleasure rather than a performance. Most tellingly, when Michael mentioned the view from the penthouse, Sarah's response was to comment on the cardinal she could see building a nest in the oak tree below, not on the real estate values in the neighborhood. "I have something to tell you both," I said, as we lingered over coffee and the strawberry shortcake Sarah had brought from a bakery near Columbia. "I've made a decision about my future." Michael set down his cup, immediately attentive. 6 months of rebuilding trust had taught him to listen carefully when I used that particular tone of voice. "I'm moving." "Moving?" Michael's eyebrows shot up. "But this place is perfect for you. You just got everything arranged exactly the way you want it." "It is perfect," I agreed. "But it's also too much. Too much space, too much isolation, too much emphasis on what I own rather than how I live." I handed them the brochures I'd been collecting for the past month. Sunrise Manor, a luxury senior community in Westchester with independent living cottages, communal gardens, and an active community of people my age who were choosing engagement over isolation. "You want to live in a retirement home?" Michael looked genuinely perplexed. "I want to live in a community," I corrected, "with people who share my interests and my stage of life. I want to join the book club, tend the community garden, maybe teach some of the writing workshops they offer." Sarah leaned forward, studying the brochures with the focused attention of someone who understood the difference between existing and living. "This looks wonderful. Look, Michael, they have a library that specializes in local history and art studios and, oh, they host a visiting author series. But the penthouse," Michael said weakly, "all this space, the view, will make someone else very happy." I pulled out another folder, this one containing real estate documents. "I'm donating it to the Alzheimer's Foundation. They'll auction it and use the proceeds to fund research and family support services." Michael was quiet for a long time, processing this decision. Finally, he spoke. "This is because of Dad, isn't it? Because of what we found out about Catherine." I considered this, looking out at the park, where couples were walking hand in hand along the paths where Robert and I had strolled for so many years. "Partly," I admitted. I realized I'd been living in a museum of memories that weren't entirely accurate. But mostly, it's because Jessica was right about one thing. I was isolated here, alone with my money and my things and my carefully curated version of the past. "So you're choosing something different." "I'm choosing something real." Sarah reached across the table and touched my hand, a gesture so natural and kind that it brought unexpected tears to my eyes. "When would you move?" she asked. "Next month. I've already put down a deposit on one of the cottages. 2 bedrooms, a small garden, and more community than I'll know what to do with." "And the money?" Michael asked. "The trust, the consulting practice, all still yours. In fact, this decision makes it easier to transfer everything cleanly. No questions about competency or undue influence, just a woman simplifying her life by choice. We spent the rest of the afternoon planning, discussing logistics and timelines and the small details that would transform my decision from dream to reality. As the sun began to set over Central Park, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: excitement about the future rather than nostalgia for the past. "There's one more thing," I said as we prepared to clear the table. "Sarah, I hope you'll consider helping Michael with something." "Of course. What is it?" "He needs to learn how to plant a garden. The cottage comes with beautiful soil, but neither of us knows anything about growing things." Sarah's laugh was like music, bright and genuine and full of life. "I'd love to help with that." Later, after they'd gone back to Michael's apartment, he'd kept the place, though they spent most of their time at Sarah's smaller but more cheerful apartment near the university. I stood on my terrace one last time as its owner, looking out at the city that had been my home for 70 years. Jessica had tried to steal my money, but she'd actually given me something more valuable: the clarity to see that wealth without purpose was just expensive loneliness. She'd forced me to examine not just my finances, but my life, and in doing so, she'd accidentally set me free. Tomorrow, I would start donating furniture to families in need, packing books for the literacy program, preparing for a life that would be smaller in square footage, but larger in every way that mattered. I thought about Robert and his parallel life in Chicago, about the complexity of love and the impossibility of truly knowing another person completely. I thought about Michael and Sarah, building something honest and real from the wreckage of his first marriage. I thought about Jessica, wherever she was, hopefully learning that true security comes from what you build, not what you take. But mostly, I thought about tomorrow, and the day after that, and all the days stretching ahead of me like blank pages waiting to be written. Not with the careful penmanship of someone preserving a museum, but with the bold strokes of someone finally ready to live her own story. I picked up my phone and called Sunrise Manor to confirm my move-in date. Then I called the Alzheimer's Foundation to finalize the donation paperwork. Finally, I called the florist to order cherry blossom branches for my new cottage, a reminder that the most beautiful things in life bloom not in spite of endings, but because of them. At 78, I was finally ready to begin. Some people spend their whole lives building walls. I learned it's never too late to plant gardens instead. The end.
Thật lòng mà nói, cảm giác đó là hoàn toàn hợp lý. Bởi vì những câu chuyện này không chỉ là giải trí, chúng gắn với lịch sử thật, những khó khăn thật, những cảm xúc thật, nên mình luôn cố gắng không bao giờ tiếp cận chúng một cách hời hợt. Mọi thứ trên kênh này, dù là hư cấu, đều được xây dựng từ sự cẩn trọng, từ việc học hỏi, từ việc lắng nghe, từ việc cố gắng thấu hiểu. Dù mình biết rằng mình sẽ không bao giờ hiểu hết được tất cả mọi thứ, và điều đó rất là quan trọng với mình, bởi vì mình không ở đây để nói thay ai cả. Mình cũng không ở đây để thay thế cho tiếng nói của bất kỳ ai. Mình ở đây như một người kể chuyện, một người tin rằng nếu câu chuyện được kể bằng sự tôn trọng và chân thành thì nó có thể tạo ra sự kết nối thay vì chia rẽ. Và điều đó thực sự có ý nghĩa với mình. Mình cũng muốn bạn biết rằng mình luôn học hỏi. Mỗi bình luận, mỗi góc nhìn, mỗi phản hồi mình đều đọc, đều suy nghĩ và cố gắng cải thiện. Vì vậy nếu có điều gì mình làm chưa tốt, mình luôn sẵn sàng lắng nghe. Không phải để tranh luận, không phải để bảo vệ cái tôi, mà là để hiểu hơn và làm tốt hơn. Bởi vì cuối cùng, kênh này không phải là chỉ về mình. Nó là về những gì chúng ta có thể cùng cảm nhận được. Là về một không gian nơi tình yêu không bị giới hạn bởi màu da, bởi định kiến hay bởi những khuôn mẫu mà xã hội đặt ra. Là về việc cho thấy rằng sự kết nối, một sự kết nối thực sự có thể tồn tại ngay cả trong những hoàn cảnh mà người ta nghĩ là không thể. Và có lẽ thế giới này cần nhiều điều đó hơn nữa, nhiều sự thấu hiểu hơn, nhiều sự đồng cảm hơn, nhiều sự cởi mở hơn để nhìn nhau như những con người trước khi nhìn vào sự khác biệt. Vì vậy, khi bạn xem xong video này, mình không chỉ muốn bạn nhớ câu chuyện, mình muốn bạn nhớ cảm giác mà nó mang lại, những khoảnh khắc khiến bạn dừng lại, những khoảnh khắc khiến bạn suy nghĩ, bởi vì chính những điều đó mới thực sự có ý nghĩa. Nó nhắc chúng ta rằng dù chúng ta khác nhau về xuất phát điểm, về văn hóa, về trải nghiệm, chúng ta vẫn có thể kết nối với nhau theo những cách vượt qua tất cả những điều đó. Và đó là một điều rất mạnh mẽ. Nếu câu chuyện này đã chạm đến bạn, dù chỉ một chút thôi, thì cảm ơn các bạn rất nhiều vì đã ở lại đây với mình. Cảm ơn các bạn vì đã lắng nghe, đã cảm nhận và đã là một phần của không gian này. Và mình hy vọng các bạn sẽ tiếp tục đồng hành cùng mình trong những câu chuyện tiếp theo. Những câu chuyện về tình yêu, về sự can đảm và về sức mạnh của việc dám kết nối trong một thế giới đầy rào cản. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở những câu chuyện tiếp theo. Hãy giữ cho trái tim mình luôn rộng mở và đừng bao giờ đánh giá thấp sức mạnh của một tình yêu dám vượt qua mọi giới hạn.